On the 25th of September, 1066, at a narrow wooden crossing over the River Derwent in Yorkshire, England, a single, unnamed Norwegian warrior stepped forward to block an advancing army of 15,000 Anglo-Saxons. He was the ultimate tactical choke point in a battle that would determine the fate of the island. The most feared maritime invaders in European history, the Vikings, had been caught completely by surprise, resting in the meadow grass without their heavy iron chainmail. Their immediate survival and the life of their ambitious king Harald Hardrada suddenly depended entirely on one massive berserker holding a bridge against thousands of heavily armed men. The sheer terrifying scale of this mismatch bought the disorganized Norwegians the crucial minutes they needed to form a defensive shield wall on the high ground, a delay paid for entirely by the rhythmic, heavy thud of a two-handed Dane axe biting deep into English oak shields. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today, we break down the grueling forced march that allowed the English to achieve total surprise, the fatal weather anomaly that dictated a disastrous command decision, and the brutal tactical reality of the legendary one-man stand at Stamford Bridge that permanently ended the Viking Age. The crisis that funneled these two disparate armies onto the banks of the River Derwent began 9 months earlier, in January 1066, with the death of the childless King Edward the Confessor. The English crown was hastily passed to Harold Godwinson, the most powerful noble in the land, but his grip on the throne was immediately contested from across the sea. To the south, William the Bastard, Duke of Normandy, was systematically amassing a vast invasion fleet, forcing Godwinson to deploy the bulk of his heavy infantry and peasant levies along the southern English coast to await an amphibious assault. But while the English king fixated entirely on the English Channel, the true, immediate danger materialized in the frigid, unforgiving waters of the North Sea. King Harald Hardrada of Norway was not a mere opportunistic raider operating on the fringes of civilization. He was the Thunderbolt of the North, a highly calculating, battle-hardened veteran who had spent years commanding the elite Varangian Guard in Constantinople, learning the intricate mechanics of imperial warfare. Recognizing the fractured political landscape of England as a fatal strategic vulnerability, Hardrada launched a massive, organized invasion to claim the English throne for himself. He arrived off the northern coast with an armada of 300 dragon-prowed longships, a terrifying blockade of timber and iron that completely choked the horizon as it cut through the cold, gray waters of the River Ouse. Aboard these vessels were roughly 9,000 to 11,000 seasoned Norwegian warriors, men who operated with lethal unified discipline rather than chaotic tribal fury. Hardrada's strategic logic was exceptionally sound. He calculated that the Norman threat in the south would completely paralyze the English central government, leaving the northern shires isolated and defenseless against a concentrated strike. This assumption was rapidly validated. Just 5 days before the fatal confrontation at the bridge, the Norwegian war machine had systematically dismantled the northern Anglo-Saxon levies at the Battle of Fulford. The regional English nobility was utterly broken, forcing the great city of York to surrender without a prolonged siege. The north had effectively fallen, and the Norwegian king was now dictating terms from a position of absolute regional dominance, setting up camp to manage the logistics of his newly conquered territory. Hardrada had crushed the northern resistance and demanded hostages, fully believing the English king was trapped hundreds of miles away in London. But he severely underestimated how fast a desperate king could move. The reality of King Harald Godwinson's response defied all military conventions of the era. Upon receiving word of the northern collapse, the English monarch realized he could not sustain a two-front war. He immediately mobilized his elite household troops, the heavily armored housecarls, alongside the regional feared militia, and drove them north with ruthless urgency. Moving an army of 15,000 men is a massive logistical undertaking, yet Godwinson forced his columns up the old Roman roads at a punishing pace, covering approximately 185 miles in just 4 days. This grueling forced march was a supreme display of operational discipline, designed to perfectly intercept the Norwegians before they could consolidate their hold on the northern shires. While the English army strained every muscle to close the distance, Hardrada and his forces remained entirely oblivious to the rapidly closing trap. On the morning of September 25, a large detachment of the Norwegian army departed their fleet anchorage at Rickhall, marching 15 miles inland to Stamford Bridge, a vital crossing over the River Derwent. Their objective was not combat, but the collection of promised hostages and tribute from the subjugated Yorkshire elite. However, the true architect of the impending disaster was not an English tactician, but the environment itself. Late September in northern England is typically brisk, but this specific day was gripped by an unseasonable, scorching weather anomaly. The heavy iron chainmail of the period, known as a byrnie, weighed roughly 30 pounds. It was constructed of thousands of interlocking, riveted iron rings that provided excellent protection against slashing blades, but it also trapped body heat relentlessly. Marching 15 miles in the suffocating, stagnant heat radiating off the Yorkshire meadows threatened to severely exhaust the Norwegian troops before they even reached the rendezvous point. Operating under the absolute conviction that the English army was entirely occupied on the southern coast, Hardrada made a pragmatic but fundamentally fatal command decision. He ordered his men to leave their heavy iron mail behind at the longships. The invasion force marched inland equipped only with their swords, spears, helmets, and lindenwood shields. Upon arriving at the Derwent, the Norwegian force casually divided itself, occupying the meadows on both the eastern and western banks of the river to rest. The atmosphere was triumphant rather than defensive. They were a conquering force awaiting political submission, having voluntarily stripped themselves of the heavy armor that provided their primary advantage in close-quarters infantry warfare. Relaxed and completely unarmored, the Vikings sat on the riverbanks, waiting for the English hostages to arrive. Instead, they saw a cloud of dust rising on the western horizon. This approaching dust did not herald the arrival of submissive Yorkshire nobility. As the haze thinned in the late morning heat, it revealed the blinding reflection of the sun catching thousands of polished spear tips and iron helmets. King Harald Godwinson had not just arrived. He had brought the full, terrible weight of the English military apparatus directly to the Norwegian staging ground. The sudden realization of this massive force exposed a fatal geographical flaw in the Viking deployment. The River Derwent physically cut the Norwegian army in two. A smaller vanguard had crossed over to the western bank, leaving King Harald Hardrada and the vast majority of the invasion force stranded on the eastern side, completely unprepared for an engagement. The English monarch did not offer a parley or a moment for the enemy to dress their ranks. Capitalizing instantly on his operational surprise, Godwinson ordered his elite housecarls into a relentless, organized advance. These professional heavy infantrymen, veterans of brutal border campaigns and royal service, moved with absolute cohesion. The rhythmic, deafening crash of thousands of marching boots striking the dry earth announced a disciplined, unbroken wall of overlapping lindenwood shields and mail armor descending upon the scattered Norwegians. On the western bank, the isolated Viking vanguard scrambled desperately to organize a cohesive defense. Military survival in the 11th century relied entirely on the structural integrity of the shield wall, an interlocking fortress of wood and iron. But lacking their heavy chainmail and caught completely out of formation, the Norwegians were effectively defenseless against the sheer kinetic shock of the English charge. The clash was not a conventional battle. It was a rapid, systematic dismantling. English broadswords and heavy spears easily bypassed the fragile wooden shields, striking directly into the unprotected linen tunics of the invaders. The numerical superiority and heavy armor of the Anglo-Saxon professionals allowed them to rapidly overwhelm the disorganized Viking pockets, breaking their defense and cutting down hundreds of men in the first brutal minutes of the engagement. Unable to sustain the overwhelming pressure of the armored housecarls, the tactical cohesion of the Norwegian vanguard instantly evaporated. The western bank turned into a highly lethal kill zone, and the surviving warriors broke their fragmented lines in sheer panic, abandoning the meadow to fall back toward the water. The survivors of the vanguard sprinted for the only escape route available, the narrow wooden planks of Stamford Bridge. But if the English crossed that bridge before Hardrada could form his lines, the entire Norwegian army would be erased. To cross the river Derwent and deliver the final, crushing blow to the invasion force, the Anglo-Saxon army had to navigate a severe geographical bottleneck. The surviving Norwegians from the vanguard funneled across Stamford Bridge, a narrow timber structure spanning the deep, rushing water. This single architectural feature instantly and fundamentally altered the tactical geometry of the entire battlefield. King Harald Godwinson possessed a massive numerical advantage, fielding approximately 15,000 hardened troops against a fractured and unarmored enemy. Yet, military superiority is entirely dependent on the physical space required to deploy it. On a wooden bridge barely wide enough to accommodate a passing cart, an army of thousands is immediately reduced to the combat effectiveness of the 2 or 3 men standing at the absolute front of the line. As the English vanguard surged onto the western edge of the planks, eager to maintain their aggressive momentum, their advance abruptly shattered against a single obstacle. A solitary, unnamed Norwegian warrior of immense physical stature stepped forward to hold the choke point. He was not equipped for standard infantry formations. Instead of a sword and a one-handed shield, he wielded the terrifying two-handed Dane axe, a weapon consisting of a massive iron-cleaving head mounted on a wooden haft up to 5 feet long. The defense of the bridge was a masterclass in exploiting terrain. To generate its lethal kinetic energy, the Dane axe required a wide, unobstructed swinging arc, a space perfectly provided by the narrow width of the bridge, which simultaneously prevented any English soldiers from attempting to flank him. Every Anglo-Saxon housecarl who stepped onto the timber was forced into a highly disadvantaged frontal engagement against a weapon specifically engineered to defeat armor. The English soldiers were met with the heavy, wet thud of the iron axe head splitting directly through lindenwood shields and iron chainmail, accompanied by the screams of men losing their footing and falling into the rushing river below. This one-man blockade was not an act of mindless tribal fury. It was a highly effective, calculated tactical delay. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, this solitary berserker systematically struck down as many as 40 professional English soldiers who attempted to push past him. His brutal efficiency entirely neutralized the momentum of the English forced march. More importantly, he secured the one resource the Norwegian army desperately lacked: time. Behind the giant, on the higher elevation of the eastern bank, King Harald Hardrada was actively exploiting these blood-bought minutes. Operating beneath his famous raven banner, the Land Ravager, the Norwegian king frantically organized his surviving thousands, ordering his unarmored men to lock their shields together and form a continuous, overlapping defensive wall along the ridge. Every swing of the Dane axe on the bridge allowed another rank of Norwegian infantry to fall into place. The English command structure was paralyzed by the geography. Their heavy infantry, highly trained to fight shoulder to shoulder in an unbreakable wall, could not leverage their mass, and their archers struggled to find a clear shot without striking their own men pinned on the narrow crossing. Frontal assaults were failing, and the English dead were piling up on the blood-soaked planks. King Harald Godwinson realized that if he could not push through this one man, the element of surprise would be lost completely. He needed a different angle. The English command quickly halted their futile, grinding frontal assaults. The pile of Anglo-Saxon dead and the slick, blood-soaked timber made the footing treacherous for any further heavy infantry charges. Furthermore, the physical stamina of the lone Norwegian, operating with a massive spatial advantage, showed no signs of breaking. Recognizing the strategic disaster of trading elite troops for mere inches of wood, the English leadership shifted their focus from the surface of the bridge to its foundation. The river Derwent, deep and fast-moving, provided a concealed vector of attack. The bridge itself, constructed with rough-hewn planks laid across horizontal spans, contained natural structural gaps between the timbers. To break the stalemate, a single Anglo-Saxon soldier detached from the main host and procured a wooden swill tub, a common logistical item likely salvaged from a nearby farm or supply cart. Wading into the water upstream, he used the half-barrel for buoyancy and drifted silently down the Derwent, completely shielded from view by the overarching framework of the bridge. He navigated the current holding a long, iron-tipped spear. The overwhelming roar of the skirmish above him, the shouts of the housecarls and the heavy impacts of the Dane axe, perfectly masked his slow, methodical approach. The Berserker above, locked into a strict frontal defense, was completely blind to his lower flank. The terrain the Viking had weaponized to hold off an army was now being turned into his execution chamber. The English soldier wedged his tub directly beneath the floorboards where the heavy footfalls of the giant were pivoting. Here, the command decision from that morning proved completely disastrous. Because the Norwegian had left his heavy chainmail back at the fleet, he wore no iron rings to protect his thighs or abdomen. Tracking the warrior's movement through the narrow wooden slats, the soldier violently thrust his spear straight up. The sudden, sharp scrape of iron sliding vertically between the wooden planks cut through the din of battle, followed instantly by a shocking silence as the giant collapsed. The spearhead drove deep into the Viking's unarmored lower body, delivering a fatal strike that bypassed his massive axe entirely. The single greatest defensive stand of the era was ended by simple, ruthless geometry. With the giant lifeless upon the timber, the physical barrier that had stalled the English vanguard vanished. The bridge was finally clear, and the English army poured across the river like a dam bursting. But waiting for them on the eastern ridge was Harald Hardrada, and he was not going to run. As the English vanguard secured the eastern bank, the thousands of housecarls and furred militia poured across the timber spans, methodically shaking out into a massive interlocking shield wall. Above them, on the ridge, stood the remnants of the Norwegian invasion force. King Harald Hardrada had utilized the time bought by his fallen Berserker to arrange his men into a defensive perimeter, their shields overlapping to form a continuous fortress of wood. The ensuing engagement was not a rapid tactical maneuver, but a grueling, hours-long test of physical endurance and unit cohesion. When the two lines finally collided, the forward ranks were instantly subjected to the immense, crushing physical weight of thousands of men pressing forward, stabbing heavy spears blindly over the rims of splintering shields. In this rigid, grinding infantry crush, the fatal command decision made earlier that morning dictated the grim arithmetic of survival. The English housecarls fought encased in their heavy iron mail, which absorbed or deflected the sweeping blows of Norwegian swords and spears. The Vikings, conversely, were fighting in their linen and woolen tunics. In a close-quarters melee where evasion is impossible and the opposing lines are locked together, raw courage cannot compensate for the absence of armor. The Anglo-Saxon professionals systematically leveraged their defensive advantage, slowly grinding down the unprotected Norwegian ranks through sheer attrition. The high ground offered the invaders a slight tactical edge, but it could not replace the security of iron rings. Recognizing his lines were bleeding out, King Harald Hardrada abandoned his static command position beneath the Raven banner. The seasoned veteran of the Varangian Guard threw himself directly into the vanguard, wielding his sword with both hands in a desperate bid to shatter the English center and break the stalemate. His aggressive forward presence temporarily rallied the wavering Norwegian infantry, pushing the Anglo-Saxon lines back a few crucial paces. However, exposing the supreme commander in the thickest part of the melee carried an absolute, irreversible risk. From the English rear ranks, a sudden volley of missiles arched over the locked shields. The metallic hiss of a heavy war arrow cutting through the dense air ended with a fatal strike directly into Hardrada's unprotected windpipe. The king collapsed instantly, effectively decapitating the command structure of the entire invasion force. With the Norwegian monarch dead on the Yorkshire grass, command briefly fell to Tostig Godwinson, the exiled brother of the English king who had allied with the invaders. King Harald offered a pause in the slaughter, extending terms of peace and quarter to his brother and the surviving Norwegians. The offer was flatly rejected. Bound by the strict, uncompromising martial codes of their era, the remaining Viking veterans refused to yield the field. Even when a delayed, heavily armored reinforcement column finally arrived from the ships at Rickall, their physical exhaustion from running 15 miles in iron mail rendered them completely combat ineffective. The battle resumed with a renewed, merciless intensity. The Anglo-Saxon infantry enveloped the fractured Norwegian positions, systematically dismantling the isolated pockets of resistance until the invading command was entirely destroyed. The Norwegian army was utterly erased from the Yorkshire fields. But as King Harald Godwinson surveyed the thousands of dead, he had no idea that a messenger was already riding north with news that would make this entire victory meaningless. The slaughter on the banks of the Derwent was so absolute that it fundamentally redrew the geopolitical map of Northern Europe. When King Harald Hardrada's fleet arrived weeks earlier, it required 300 longships to transport the Norwegian invasion force. When the broken remnants were finally permitted to sail home by the English monarch, they needed only 24. This staggering casualty rate effectively broke the military capacity of Scandinavia to project large-scale power across the sea. The nameless giant on the wooden bridge became the ultimate, fitting metaphor for the Viking Age itself. Terrifying, fiercely independent, and capable of inflicting massive localized destruction, but ultimately overcome by the relentless, organized march of a changing, structured world. Stamford Bridge was not merely a tactical defeat, it was the definitive end of 3 centuries of Norse terror. Yet, this monumental triumph immediately morphed into a strategic death sentence for the Anglo-Saxon defenders. As King Harald Godwinson stood victorious over the ruined Viking host, the promised messenger arrived from the southern coast bearing catastrophic intelligence. On the 28th of September 1066, just 3 days after the heavy iron of the housecarls had secured the north, Duke William of Normandy successfully landed his massive invasion fleet at Pevensey. The English heavy infantry had survived the grueling northern campaign, but their reward was another punishing, 250-mile forced march back down the length of the country. Crippled by deep physical exhaustion, mounting casualties, and fractured supply lines, the Anglo-Saxon army was now walking blindly toward the armored Norman cavalry waiting at Hastings. King Harald had successfully defended his realm against one of the greatest warrior kings of the era, only to lose his life, his crown, and his country less than 3 weeks later. The English victory at Stamford Bridge ensured that Britain would never become a Scandinavian province, but by bleeding their own military apparatus dry to secure that outcome, the Anglo-Saxons inadvertently handed their island over to the Normans. Subscribe to our channel to relive the great chapters of history together, and join us for the next episode of World Chronicles.